How to finish a sweater. Hi everyone, Norman here. Today's video will be all about seaming a sweater like this one here with set-in sleeves. I will show you the basic technique first, and then we will focus on all the small little tips and tricks that make all the difference. Because here's the thing, sewing together the different pieces of a sweater is actually remarkably straightforward. But if you don't apply a couple of simple tricks, the results can often be a little bit underwhelming. So let's dive right into it and show you how to finish a sweater. In a sweater, you typically have three kinds of seams, and each requires a slightly different technique. First of all, you have vertical seams where you need to seam together a selvage stitch with a selvage stitch. Then you have horizontal seams here at the shoulders where you need to seam together a bind of edge with a bind of edge, or cast on edge if you knit top down. And then here around the armholes you also have diagonal seams, and here you often, these are typically the most complicated, here you have to seam together a selvage stitch with a bind of edge. Let's show you all three techniques. Let's start with the easiest seam where you join selvage stitch with selvage stitch. Here you can use a technique called mattress stitch. First, thread your tail on a blunt tapestry needle. If your tail is not long enough, then of course you need to do some scrap yarn. There are two preparation stitches, and then we can do the mattress stitch. To start, I pinch the two sides here in between my fingers, and then we need to do two preparation stitches, or rather one in my case. So here, these are the little bars. So here, this is the selvage stitch, and this is the first knit column, and in between are these little bars, and we're going to use these for seaming. But first, here, this is the cast on edge, and here, see, there should be a little knot-like structure, and I'm going right through that. If you are not using your tail to do the seaming, you would have to go through this stitch here first and then over on this side. And then we can already start with the repeat. So over here, you need to find the first little bar here, this bar here, and just pull your tapestry needle through. Then you need to move over on the other side, find the next little bar here over on this side, and then pull your tapestry needle through. Then move over to the other side again, find the next little bar, pull your tapestry needle through. Go over to the other side, pull the tapestry needle through. So you always move back and forth, always going underneath the bars on either side. And once you're covered an inch or so in this manner, let's do two more stitches here. So once you're covered an inch or so, you simply pull tight. And as you can see, don't let the fabric pucker, massage things out. And as you can see, you create an almost invisible seam in this manner. The seams here at the top of your shoulders are typically just as easy to close. So if you look very closely at your bind of edge, you will notice that right below the bind of edge there is a row of V's here as well. So the bind of typically creates a row in the same breadth, and we are going to go through this very row to close the seam. So I have my tail here, and I'm going to find the very first V of the row. In this case, this is the edge stitch. Often this is a little bit looser or distorted but you just pull the yarn through that anyway. Now over on this side things get a little bit more tricky. You need to pull the yarn through the V's as well. However, this side here is upside down. So the V's will actually appear as A's. See, these are the V's, but they are upside down, so it will look a bit like an A. So here this is a V, but actually we need to go here right underneath that edge stitch. That's going to be our first stitch. From here things are a little bit clearer. So here this is a V, and you just go below both legs. Try not to pierce the yarn. Then here same on the other side, but here we go through the A. Tighten up. Then find the V. Here is my V. Pull the yarn through. Here on this side, find the A. Often it's a bit distorted, so look to the row above so you can easily identify. After 1 or 2 stitches, always tighten up. Here over on this side, go below the V. Over on this side, go below the A. So very easy technique. One note here, sometimes you have a slope bind off, so in this case you wouldn't go below both legs of the same stitch. Rather, in this case you can also go diagonal. So if you want a sloped or a little bit curved seam with a nice transition, always go diagonal. In this case I don't need to do this, but I'm gonna show you how to do this a bit later on in this video, where I show you the real life examples of me seaming a sweater. And this here will be the result. So as you can see, also a very nice seam, but maybe not 100% invisible. So this kind of seam will always be a little bit visible, but if you maintain a nice and even tension, it's gonna be just as neat. The last kind of seam is here when you need to set in the sleeves and you have a bind of edge over on this side and selvage stitches over on this side. But the technique is actually just as easy, and in fact you don't even need to learn a new technique. It's the same, you just need to mix things. So you start on either side and then you go pull the yarn here below. This is a bind of edge, so again you go below the V's, and then over on this side here you have a selvage stitch, so you go pull the yarn here below the bars. Then you move over to the other side, pull the yarn here through the V's, and then find the next bar over on this side, pull through. Then find the next V over on this side, bar over on this side, V over this side. Let me check. Well, here maybe I will go diagonal in this case. Bar over on this side. Tighten up after every couple of stitches. V and bar. So as promised, this is no new technique. You're just mixing the two techniques. Again, here, this is what I was talking about here. I am going diagonal for a nice transition. So let's tighten things up here. See, this is the kind of seam you create. Further down the sleeve, you will probably come to a place where the bind off ends and you have a selvage stitch on either side. Well, and in this case, you just do the same. So you just mix things, and in this case, you would go through the bars over on this side. So if you have these kind of mixed edges, you also, well, you work with whatever is available. So if it's an edge stitch, you go below the bars, and if it's a bind off edge, you go below the V's or A's, depending on how things align. See? Further down, you typically come to a place where you have bind off edge against bind off edge, and in this case, well, then you just go below the V's and A's on both sides. So, just like I said, you work with whatever is presented to you, and if you notice, well, this looks a little bit sloppy, you can always retrace your steps, undo the seam, and then maybe go through a stitch one row below or different parts of the stitch and check if that looks better. And if you follow these steps here, this will be the result. So you should have a very, very nice and even seam. Now that we covered the basics, it's time for some important tips. And here's the most important tip of them all. Before you even start to seam or knit a single stitch of your sweater, you need to plan out your selvages. So I've knitted this hem here in a 2x2 rib stitch, and a 2x2 rib stitch is a 4-stitch repeat, knit 2, purl 2. This means you cast on multiples of 4. However, I cast on multiples of 4 plus 2. That is, so I start my row here with 2 knit stitches and end with 2 knit stitches. That's because one stitch on either side gets eaten up by the seam. And then once I'm done with the seaming here, see, I've shown you this at the beginning of this video, then you are left with a rib that is just as wide as the other rib stitches here, and it's gonna be, your seam is gonna be just as invisible. And this specifically applies to any form of color work, but especially stranded knitting or fair isle. Because once you seam things shut, the colors you used for your selvage stitch will vanish. So you need to chart out your pattern in a way that once you've seamed things, it makes sense, and account for the selvage stitch. But this goes even further than that, because if you ever try to seam fair isle, then you might know that the selvage stitch, the immediate selvage stitch, is often a little bit unstable, and it can be very tricky to find the bars, and the actual bars are even a little bit, well, slanted or so. So in these cases, I actually recommend moving in half a stitch and rather go below the bars here between the V's, or even move in a full stitch and go through these bars here. Then the resulting seam will often be a little bit better and neater. However, of course, you need to account for that in your chart, and of course you need to realize that if you move in half a stitch or a full stitch, the resulting edge will be a little bit thicker here. The ridge here on the inside will be thicker, but I feel often it's neater. But which selvage is best? So there are a million different kinds of selvage stitches. I have a full tutorial here on YouTube where I show you, I don't know, 10, 20 different choices. But very, very few of them are actually suitable for seaming. So a lot of knitters seem to enjoy slip stitch selvages. And certainly this edge here, this little edge here looks a lot better than this, well, almost like knotted edge here. Not very pretty. However, such a slip stitch selvage is typically quite a bit looser than a stockinette stitch edge. And so it won't be able to lend as much stability to your seam as a, stockinette stitch selvage. Plus, but this is more important, a slip stitch selvage only creates one of these bars where you do your mattress stitch through for every 2 rows. So later on it will be impossible to adjust for your gauge properly. Like, I don't know, if you have one like more like puff sleeves or so, or shoulders, then you won't be able to seam properly because you just don't have enough bars here to go through. So if you ask me, you only have 2 choices. So in most cases, a standard stockinette stitch edge selvage is the best for seaming. So you knit the first and last stitch of every right side row, and you purl the first and last stitch of every wrong side row, and the result will be an edge where you have a bar here for every stitch. It's quite the dense edge here. It's not all that pretty, but it doesn't need to be pretty because that part here, these little knots here, they vanish later on. Your second choice would be a garter stitch selvage. So this, you knit the first and last stitch of every row, no matter if it's on the right or the wrong side, and the result will be this knotted edge here. And the important bit here is there is also a mattress stitch alternative for garter stitch. I'll add links to the description below because it will kind of blow the scope of this video here. The important bit is that this seam, the resulting seam, can be a little bit more invisible for a lot of more advanced knitting stitch patterns. So just as a little teaser, this would be the resulting seam if I joined or did the mattress stitch for garter stitch. I do feel that this often can be the better choice for any kind of knit purl combination. I mean, it's still a little bit noticeable, but I feel not in a bad way. Here's my third tip. So typically you need to increase along the sleeves and sometimes even along the torso, like after the hem or so. Sometimes patterns get wider. And here's the problem with increases. So here we have a KRL, and the problem is between these stitches there is no proper bar here. It's sort of distorted. So if you place your increase right after the selvage stitch, this often means you don't end up with a nice little bar where you can seam through. So as a result, I recommend, there's two options here. Either you place the increase after the second or third stitch, leaving you with nice little bars here along the selvages, or you place the increase right on the selvage, so like with a KFB or so, and then you don't go through these bars here, but instead move half a stitch in or one full stitch in and go through these complete bars. If you do it like this, the resulting edge here on the inside of your sweater, this ridge here, will be bigger, but of course you won't see the increases. Or you move it, that's what I did here for this sweater here, you move it 2 stitches in. So here you have the increase line, the seam, and to the side here there are the increases. They will be slightly visible, but the resulting seam here in the center is almost unnoticeable. That's my preferred way, but in either case, you kind of need to be strategic about it and place them correctly. Otherwise, the seam here will not look very pretty. Just like the selvage, there are also ways to optimize your bind-off edges. So I personally don't think you need to switch to a different bind-off. When it comes to the shoulder seams, you typically do not want them to be stretchy. They need to be able to uphold all the weight that rests on them. So in my experience, a standard bind-off is just fine with one adjustment. So here I slip the last stitch of every row before the bind off to create this sloped edge here. I'll link you my full tutorial on how to create these perfectly sloped bind off edges up in here. And this has really two benefits. First of all, it does look neater and it will make seaming a lot easier, but also whenever you seam things together, so here you join the sleeve caps here with the armhole, then you will transport fabric towards the wrong side, because there will always, after seaming, there will always be a little ridge. And if your edge has all these little stairs here, you will transport more fabric to the wrong side. So these sloped edges are really a win-win if you ask me. Whenever you want to close a seam, you obviously need some yarn to thread on your tapestry needle. So what I recommend is, when you cast on, just leave a tail that is long enough to close this seam later on, and then just wind it up like so. And use a hair clip here like this to secure this little bundle so it doesn't interfere with your knitting. And then once you bound off all stitches, also leave a tail that is long enough to close this seam here. And this has the added benefit. Well, first of all, it's a little bit more secure, and secondly, you won't have to weave in as much ends, because if you join in a new yarn to do the seaming, you will have to weave in this end and the tail of the new yarn, and here you only have to weave the tail at the end of the seam. So it's both more secure and saves you time. Your first step before you actually do any seaming is blocking. If you have a paper cutout, you can use this as a guideline to verify your blocking and your size. If you don't have a paper pattern, you can also use the measurements from your schematics and then copy them to your blocking board. In a similar manner, you should have like the sleeve length, the biceps girth, things like that should be part of your schematics, and you can copy these measurements to create an rough outline on your blocking board. Blocking first has two advantages. First of all, blocking a finished sweater is always a little bit more complicated because you risk creating fold lines. I mean, you can use these Becker rods, these thin foam cores from the hardware store, usually used for caulking or so, to reduce the risk. So simply insert them into the seams to avoid fold lines. Still, a good sweater pattern will have sections with some built-in ease, so especially here around the sleeve caps. So typically this means you have to skip stitches or go through certain stitches twice. So if your pieces lay flat and are blocked to the correct size, it will be so much easier to do the seaming later on. So in case you're wondering, I always, without fail, I always block first and then sew. And just one note here, I typically avoid blocking the hem or the cuff, the ribbing, because if you also block that, all the stretchiness will be, well, not gone, but it won't spring back anymore, and typically that's what you want. Now that we have all the details out of the way, it's time to show you how to seam a sweater for real. So I've knitted this sweater, or the pieces for a sweater, with yarn from James Makes Yarn. As you can see, it's already blocked. These speckles here are to die for. Now, theoretically speaking, you could start with any seam, but I recommend starting with the shoulders. I feel this is the easiest way to add in the set-in sleeves later on. Now, you could, theoretically speaking, start with some well-placed pins here to kind of solidify the seam. However, typically the shoulder seam is so short, so I don't do this. But you could, but for me, I typically don't. If you want to seam together the shoulder, this means bind off edge with bind off edge. So on one side you go through the V's, like I showed you before, and on the other side through the ace. So it doesn't really matter which side, just pick any. And so here on this side, I will go through the V's, and on this side here, on this side through the V's, and here through the A's. So I start over on this side and go through a V over on this side. So the first stitches are always a little bit more difficult, but because the seam isn't stable yet, but after a couple of stitches, things will be more easy. So here through these stitches, make sure that you don't accidentally like split the yarn or so as you go underneath them. But other than that, it's, as you can see, just the same technique I showed you before. You only need to make sure that you don't miss the spot where you need to go diagonal. Let's get this nice and neat here. So I think this here is one of the spots where I need to go diagonal. Where is this V here? There. There's C, and now I need to move down a row. And the same over here on this side. But that's about it. So you weave back and forth between the two sides and pull tight ever so often. Sometimes it helps if you kind of, stretch things apart so you can see things a little bit clearer, because sometimes also the bind off kind of rolls in a little bit. So that's the main reason here why I'm showing you this part, because I mean the overall technique is the same. And then here over on this side you do the same thing you do like when you do a Kitchener stitch or so. You just go through the legs of the stitch until you can't anymore. So here over on this side. Finish, then pull on the seam, take a close look at it. You, as I said, you can always undo your seam if you feel like, okay, this looks a little bit sloppy, and you pull tight and you massage things out and you go like, okay, this still doesn't look right. Well, you can always undo it one stitch at a time. If you do that, consider joining in a new length of yarn, because you probably will notice that the thread will have lost a lot of its stability, possibly because the plies and twisted, and you also lost a little bit of fiber. So if you undo things, consider joining in a new length of yarn to guarantee that this seam here is stable. Once you're satisfied with your seam, you can simply hide the rest of the tail here on the inside. Now, a word of warning, don't pull tight. So I just go loosely through that edge, because you don't want to reinforce it any further. You don't want to end up with one solid brick here sitting on top of your shoulders. So I just go through it loosely and pierce a bit through the strands. But I mean, this bit here already lost most of its stretchiness. As you can see, there's still a little bit left, and you don't want to lose this as well. So I just go through it loosely for a couple of stitches, and that's it. And then you can just trim away the excess. I always leave a little stop here. because this is going to felt over after you've washed this and worn this sweater a couple of times. And then there's that. And then obviously you need to do this exact same thing over on this side and also close this shoulder seam. In the next step, I recommend seaming the sleeve cap to your armholes. Your sleeve cap has 3 important points: the cap notch, the armhole notch, and over here the start of your armhole. And you can use clippy stitch markers to roughly pin them in place. They can serve as a guideline for your overall pattern. Weirdly enough, a lot of knitting patterns don't actually feature an armhole notch, typically because they don't add too much cap ease here. But over here on this side, your last bind off stitch, so this part here was probably knitted straight without any bind offs. So, and you have the exact same thing over here on this side. There's a little stretch here where you probably didn't bind off any stitches, and these need to align. These will serve as your armhole notches. Why is this here important? So, this slope here over on this side is typically mirrored in a knitting pattern. And you seam together edge, bind off stitch to bind off stitch. So, this bit is easy, you just go through the next stitch. However, here on this side, here for the sleeve caps, that typically doesn't work anymore, because this is a bind off edge and this is a selvage. So because of the different row and stitch gauge and any cap ease you might have added, you will have more stitches here, more stitches over on this side than on this side. So you kind of need to chart things out, and these pins will help you with that process. So you have the seam on either side, you have your little pins in place, and then what you have to do is, I mean, you can also look in your pattern and work it out from there. Really doesn't matter. It depends on how your pattern is structured and the schematics and so. But you simply count the rows over on this side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. You count the rows over on this side, and then you also count the stitches over on this side. So you always have these little V's here below the bind off edge, and you just count those V's and all those stitches, and maybe there's a little selvage in between as well. Then you count the bars, and you do this over on this side as well. So take my pattern for example. If you were to measure things, then this straight line here would be just as long as this diagonal here over on this side. This means this edge here is actually a little bit longer, maybe, well, an inch or 2 centimeters or something like that. However, this is 60 rows, whereas here there are only 38 stitches I can go through. So as a result, when I seam things together, for every second V I go through here on this side, I need to go underneath 2 bars over on this side. So I go through 1 V, 1 bar. The next V, 2 bars. 1 V, 1 bar. Next V, 2 bars. So you need to chart this out, and depending on how much cap ease you added or your pattern added here to the sleeve cap, the numbers will be different. Maybe you have the exact same number of stitches, which is possibly rare. Maybe if it's garter stitch or so, then that could be. But typically you have actually less stitches over on this side. So you need to know where you need to skip things. Once you are satisfied, set aside a tail that is roughly 3 to 4 times as long as here, the total length of the shoulder cap seam, and then thread that on a tapestry needle. So let's get started. So this here is my cap notch, and I'm going to so I know that I bound off 6 stitches here in the center, so I am going here in the centermost stitch, or 1 stitch removed. I'm going to pull my yarn through. However, I will keep half of the tail sticking out. So we will seam this half and then use the remainder of the tail to sew the other half. This has the added advantage that you can be absolutely sure that here the cap notch and your shoulder seam are perfectly aligned, and you know, if you need to skip a stitch or so further down or under the armpit, no one is going to notice. However, here this bit is kind of important that they align. And then you can already remove your clippy marker. You don't really need it anymore. And then you need to find the first bar here between the stitches. So this is my shoulder seam, and you need to go all the way in. So here, this is the first little bar, and I'm going to pull the yarn all the way through. And from here, you simply follow the standard mattress stitch repeat we've been doing all along. So you go underneath the V here on this side, and then I go below 1. So in my case, at least, I go below 2 bars here over on this side. Then I find the next little V here, and you can see that here I actually already need to go down, so I'm already going diagonal here. And then I will go underneath 1 stitch. However, personally I feel it looks better in knitting when everything that comes here below is more straight and the ruffles or puff sleeves are more, well, all the cap piece is here distributed more closer to the shoulder. So here I will actually go below 2 stitches. That's a personal preference to end up with more ease here on top and less here below. Do as you see fit. And then here, this is the next V. And now I will go below 1 stitch. So as I said, this boils down to preferences, and I'm already going to pull. There's the tail. Pull tight here, and then find the next V over here on this side. So the only difference is here that you go below the bars on one side and below the V's on the other side, but everything else should be, or it should be rather simple regardless, I feel, you know. So I'm slowly getting closer to the armhole notch, and here is a portion where the slope is rather steep and you really need to go diagonal. So really pay attention that you skip rows and go diagonal, so your seam ends up neat and nice, and you don't have parts of the selvage stitch peeking through. I think, yeah, like so. Let's see. Oh, I already went below that. So here, see, I need to go vertically, but diagonally, sorry, to make things neat. Let's do just 1 here for a change. And then, where's the next reason I went? Okay, so here is the first bit where I need to pick up a bar here in between on this side, and then a bar over on this side, and then here's another bar. So these are rows where I didn't actually bind off, and then I don't go in between the V's, and from here on, all this stretch, I'm actually going to go here in between the bars, between two stitches, because this is actually selvage stitch to selvage stitch. Pull tight. At this point already take a close look at your seam. Does it look nice? If not, redo sections. Sometimes you end up with little holes or so. So definitely check. And then also kind of gauge how here, so this stretch here, you can tell a little bit, this stretch is still a tiny little bit longer. So when I go here, there is the bar between two stitches. Where is it? Just a second. There it is. Now I will also go below 2 bars over on this side. But as I said, I try to bunch up the ease up in here. So here when I sew selvage stitch to selvage stitch, things more or less aligned, because it can kind of pucker weirdly above your armpits, and that typically doesn't look all that nice. So I try to avoid this as much as possible. So I think I need to squeeze in one more where I just go below 1, but that should be it. And ideally speaking, when you come to the armhole notch, no, that's not the bar here, that's the bar. When you come to the armhole notch, the corners already should align. And then once you hit the armhole notch, it's back to seaming together V's with A's, because of course this is a bind of edge, this is a bind of edge, so you try to find the V's. So here, this is a row of V's. Of course the slope is rather steep, so there's a V, and let's find VA over on this side. So it appears to be here. This is the A. And here is our next V over on this side. Sometimes it's very difficult to see, so it helps if you glance to the stitches above. So here, you know, you go like, where is it? But over here you can clearly see it, and then you just follow that column of stitches to find your V's and A's, and keep splitting the yarn here. Try to avoid that because typically it looks less neat. And here over on this side the same. Okay, where is it? Well, here is clearly the V, 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 V. You follow that all the way to the top. There you go. So this is no new technique. We just kept on mixing two techniques here along our sleeves for the best possible look. So here, this is the V, the A, sorry, inverted V, I was gonna say, and you just follow that seam. Now before you close these last stitches, first of all, make sure to count them and see if you can make things match. Otherwise, you know, you need to skip one on either side. Take a very close look at the seam that you've created, and especially check if some things are puckered. Definitely pull on the tail, but then let things ease up. And then if things are still puckered, there seems to be an issue. If the puckering is on this side of the sleeve, so on the sleeve cap side, that's normal. You are always gonna create a bit of puff sleeves. That's normal, or rather working as intended, because you actually want a little bit more room for your shoulders. If there's puckering here on the side of the front or back, whatever part you are sewing together, then that typically is not good, and you should try to retrace your steps. Pull your seam out one stitch at a time and redo things and work out what you need to or can do better, because any puckering here on this side is going to be noticeable. And then of course you finish those last steps, stitches here, just the way you did over on the shoulder side. So there is no difference here. Let's remove the stitch marker here, or pin. Don't need it anymore, it's just in the way. And then here, this is the last V, and then we are going here through. Yes, here, this stitch and this stitch. So pull tight, massage things out, and we are done. Once you are satisfied with your seam, find the other end of the tail and turn your project around. I personally find it a little bit easier to seam in this direction, and that's why I turned things around. And then it's going to be the exact same all over. So you find the first little bar here between two stitches. The only difference is now, because I turned things around, so I went through here, this is my tail, so I can see I already went through this. The only difference is now I'm not going through the V's anymore, but through the A's, because I turned things upside down. That is the difference here. But other than that, it's going to be the same all over again. So you just follow the exact same steps. And again, as you can see, I'm sort of trying to bunch up, a little bit more fabric here over on this side. And I lost my tapestry needle here, so I'm trying to bunch up, go through two V's here, two bars here, and then always two, and then followed by one, followed by one. Once you finished seaming, definitely take a very close look at your whole shoulder area. Go all the way around, inspect the seam, and definitely consider trying your work in progress on. Throw it over a bit like a poncho. Maybe use some safety pins to close here the armpit and a couple, the seam of the sleeve a little bit. Throw it over and take a critical look at your sweater in the making, because maybe things don't fit the way they should, or maybe the seam doesn't really fall very nicely and it puckers or bunches out or so. Then undo the seam and redo or adjust the pattern here for your sleeve cap for a better fit. Right now it's still, it's certainly annoying, but it's easier to do that than, finishing everything up, putting things on, and then noticing, oh damn, this doesn't fit at all, this looks horrible, and then you're gonna be devastated. Right now it's just a minor little inconvenience. Later on it's gonna be a major one, so fix things while they're still possible. Next, I typically close the arms just to get this out of the way, and this bit here should be straightforward. So I always, as you can see, leave a very long tail here to do the seaming. That's entirely up to you. And then you just start seaming. If the tail is long, well, as you can see, it can be a little bit annoying to pull it through in the beginning. That's the nature of things. But this is just a standard mattress stitch. So you just go through the little bars here between the stitches and work all the way up. Depending on your gauge, like maybe you knitted your sweater with 2mm needles or something like that, it's okay to go underneath 2 bars to speed things up. You probably won't be able to notice it in the end, or the difference later on, and it's just going to be so much faster, because if it's a very fine gauge and you go below each single little bar, seaming will just take forever. So consider doing that. But as you can see, I planned my little ribbings here in a way that I don't end up with a interruption, or a barely visible interruption. Let's put it that way. Anyway, this is here just me fighting with my very, very long tail. But other than that, it's just a mattress stitch. Now, before I come to the armpit, here are 2 little things I wanted to mention. So first of all, if you mapped out your selvage stitch the right way, see how invisible this transition is. I mean, if you stretch it out, you can kind of tell, because this is less stretchy, the seam is less stretchy than the rest. But other than that, I mean, it's invisible. It doesn't interrupt the 2x1 rib stitch in this case at all. Now this seam here is as easy as it gets. It's just mattress stitch all the way up. So strictly speaking, it wouldn't be necessary to use 2 pins, because you have an equal number of stitches on either side, so why would you? However, it's kind of easy to miss a bar between the stitches, and then you get an offset. So what I typically do is I place 1, 2, or 3 choice little safety pins or stitch markers here along the way. You can use the increases or decreases, if you knit it top down, as a guideline. And then when you come to the stitch markers, you can use these to check and see, okay, did I end up with an offset or didn't I? If things match well, you can just remove it. If there's a slight little offset, well, you know, nobody's gonna know. Just go through 2 bars on one side and then things will match again. If it's like a huge offset of 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches, well, obviously you would have to retrace your steps a little bit and see where you made the mistakes. But if it's just 1 stitch, you know, along such a big long seam, nobody is going to notice it. Anyway, I'll continue seaming and see you at the armpit. So as you can see, I made it right up to the armpit. Well, it's quite a handful of fabric here on my table, but I guess you can still see there are a few stitches left here. Now I typically leave a tail that is very long, so I can just continue seaming across this bit. So I mean, this really boils down to preference. Do you really want to drag along such a long tail here? All the sleeve, and then so you can continue knitting, seaming here down this bit. It really boils down to preferences. I rather prefer that, because I feel that, you know, if it's just one long seam, I feel it's more stable or so, if that makes sense. But this is entirely up to you and your preferences. You can join in a new length of yarn and start right at the hem and seam all the way up here, or you continue seaming. Just make sure that at the transition things are suddenly upside down, of course. Oh well. So you need to switch up when it comes to the bars. You need to go before you went through the upper part of the bar, and now you go through the lower part. But that's about it. So I will continue seaming here all the way down to the hem, and I guess I'll see you there. So let's pull this tight so you can see here the kind of transition this creates. So I feel it's, you know, I mean, you can see this bit a little bit if you feel, okay, this could be yet neater. There should be quite some tails left here on the inside, and I might show you later on. And what you could do is you could gloss across this area a little bit with duplicate stitch, so you get like one totally seamless transition. But you know, I personally feel this is actually neat enough. I mean, it's a seamed sweater, and you can see the seam as long as it's neat, and I feel this is just pretty enough. Now, as I make my way down to the hem, here's another little tip. So every couple of inches, of course, you need to carefully pull on the tail to close the seam. And whenever you do so, make sure that you don't accidentally like pucker the fabric, and really, you know, massage the seam and stretch it out. You don't want to lose the stretchiness here along the edge, even as invisible as it is, but you still don't want it to be less stretchy than the rest of the fabric. I mean, it will always be a little bit less stretchy, but you don't want it to be puckering or in any way constricted. So always, whenever you pull on the tail, always kind of, well, stretch the seam out again. Well, anyway, I'm going to close here the remainder of the seam, and then we'll take a look at the result. So let's follow that seam here all the way towards the bottom. I feel this was quite a success. Of course, this is the point where two colorways are meeting, so it's kind of unavoidable that this is a little bit more noticeable. The same here, we have 3-4 different sections meeting, but still there is, even if I push things to the foreground, there is no hole here. And then if I follow it here all the way down the sides, of course the mattress stitch is almost unnoticeable. Only here, that very last stitch is often a little bit noticeable, and this is kind of unavoidable because this ridge is pushing things to the foreground, and it's always gonna be a little bit noticeable. But then again, I mean, this portion is hidden underneath your arms anyway, so it's not going to be the biggest deal anyway. And that's it. That's how I seamed and finished this sweater. Now, of course, I didn't show you how I picked up stitches for the collar and then knitted this folded collar. That would be a different video, but please comment below if you are interested. Please like this video if you enjoyed watching. And as always, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.